Religion Center here. We have a real privilege in store for us in this hour this morning, hearing from Alexander Dushku and Stephen Smith. I actually forgot to bring my copy of the program. Which one are we? You're going first? We'll go in the order of the program. So let me just say, you'll have the introductory materials. Alexander Dushku is he's really, at this point, one of the lead litigators for the LDS Church on high-profile, particularly constitutional cases, shareholder at Kirton, McConkie, and someone who I have been the beneficiary of for many years, including learning from him when we were co-authoring an article many years ago in the 90s. And Stephen Smith is someone who has been a long-time expert in the field of law and religion, constitutional law, law of church and state. Has written many books and is someone I have tremendous respect for. So we're very grateful to have both of these two here. And I think without taking more from their time, we'll just turn things over to them. Yep.
Well, thank you, Cole, for that introduction. I need to begin with the usual disclaimer that I don't speak for the church as I offer my thoughts and comments this morning. So anything you hear that sounds wrong, just ignore it, or at least don't attribute it to the church. But I am grateful to be here. As a lawyer who finds himself spending most of his time on religious freedom issues, this is an important event. I'm grateful to be here, but I'm especially grateful that you are here. As Elder D. Todd Christofferson said just a few days ago, we live in challenging times. Religious freedom is indeed under fire, and things may get worse before they get better. But these are our times. This is our moment to defend our constitutional freedoms. So the fact that you are here on a Friday morning in July, when you probably should be getting ready to head out to the beach or to launch a boat somewhere, says a lot. It says that you care about religious freedom. It says you're interested in learning more. And for some of you, it says that you want to stay on Bill Atkins' good side, which is reason enough to attend. The theme of this conference is religion in an era of social change. I can't imagine a more timely and important theme. We live in a time of remarkable social change. Technology, globalization, changes in family structure and in beliefs regarding marriage, gender, and sexuality, the decline in religiosity in Western nations, all these forces and trends and many more are changing the way people view religion and religious institutions. And they are putting great pressure on religious freedom in important and often unforeseen ways. The work of vigorously and wisely defending religious freedom has never been more vital. My topic on your program is prioritizing religious freedoms, but I decided to change it a bit to religious freedom imperatives. I want to address 4 issues that I believe are imperatives for anyone who is interested in defending religious freedom. First, the imperative to have a clear understanding of the cultural and social moment we are living in and the challenges it poses to religious freedom. Second, the imperative to learn how to speak and advocate for religious freedom in terms that are relevant to the current cultural moment. Third, the imperative, as Elder Wickman explained yesterday, to prioritize religious freedoms and not overreach, including setting realistic priorities based on what is essential and what is defensible in the current culture. And fourth, the imperative to get involved in defending religious freedom. First, understanding our current cultural moment and the threat it imposes to religious freedom. And bear with me for a little bit. This is going to take a bit, but I'm actually going to get to a point. The first rule of persuasion is to know your audience. if we are to be effective advocates for religious freedom, we have to understand the culture around us and how our fellow Americans think and understand life. We live in an age of individualism. In many ways, people are now freer than ever to choose the life they want. The vast majority of Americans are wealthy by almost any historical standard. With rare exception, we've been liberated almost totally from the sort of extreme poverty that was routinely experienced throughout nearly all of human history and that still exists today in many areas of the world. We have health care that not even emperors could dream of a century and a half ago, with many of our biggest health problems coming from eating too much food rather than from history's biggest challenge, hunger and starvation. The ancient scourge of racism is in dramatic decline, with virtually all segments of American society believing it is wrong and most outright denouncing it. Women are free to choose like never before. Cultural and legal constraints that once limited their options have rapidly given way to a plethora of social, professional, and political opportunities. Access to birth control and abortion are now legal rights that are vigorously protected, liberating women, if they so choose, from unwanted pregnancies and marriage. Almost everyone can get a college education if they want one, allowing them to escape economic hardship and move up the economic ladder. Many social, moral, and legal constraints that once limited various freedoms have been loosened or abandoned. There's never been so much freedom to leave your small town, your inadequate spouse, your dysfunctional family, or your allegedly oppressive religion. There are very few legal or social constraints on whatever sexual practices you prefer, and so on. I hasten to add that I'm not suggesting these sweeping freedoms are always good for individuals in society. I only note that they exist as basic elements of our culture. And not only do we have such freedoms, as a culture, we celebrate the exercise of those freedoms as an ultimate good. The cultural message is to be your own person, do your own thing. Don't let anyone tell you what to do. Be true to yourself, follow your dreams. And not only should you be true to who you are, but you should never, ever stand in the way of someone else being true to who they are. Having elevated the individual will to such high status, it naturally follows that one of the worst social crimes is to be judgmental or discriminatory with respect to someone else's personal choices. In sum, our culture has embraced a form of extreme individualism where personal autonomy, individual identity, choice, equality, personal and sexual expression, and personal dignity are its core values. I'm reminded of a country song, and I don't listen to much country music, so this was entirely accidental that I heard this, but a country song entitled, "I Want to Talk About Me," where in response to a girlfriend who can't stop talking about herself, Toby Keith sings, quote, "I want to talk about me. I want to talk about I want to talk about number one, oh my, me my, what I think, what I like, what I know, what I want, what I see." Well, our culture relates to that sentiment entirely. Now step back and think for a moment about the power of this individualism narrative within our current culture and society. It is so strong that in a few short years, not only have we redefined the ancient, historically ubiquitous definition of marriage to include same-sex couples, something that simply as a matter of fact was virtually unthinkable only a few decades ago, but we have undertaken the process of redefining the very nature of gender and sex so as to affirm and support people whose personal sense of gender does not conform with their own biology. Now think about that. The first question we ask when a child is born, is it a boy or a girl, has now fundamentally been called into question by the desire to affirm an allegedly deeper gender identity than biology itself affords. That is the power of this cultural narrative. Now, I want to make clear, I'm not talking about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Either way, it's a powerful reality that we are living in. Of course, there are challenges and difficulties with this extreme focus on individualism and personal autonomy. In the midst of all this freedom from social constraints, there's also a profound loneliness, a quest for community, to borrow a line from sociologist Robert Nesbitt. Too much individualism and personal autonomy tend to liberate people not only from oppressive constraints, but also from life's enduring and defining attachments. So people seek community in other ways and forms. Facebook and Instagram are great examples. In fact, they're the perfect communities and the perfect metaphors for this highly individualistic age. The primary purpose of these new communities is to allow you to post things about yourself. And how fitting that the name we give for the most common thing posted is the selfie. And if someone in your virtual community doesn't like what you've posted or discomfits you, you can simply unfriend them or drop them as a follower with a mere click. Now, many of you are wondering, what on earth does this have to do with religious freedom? Quite a bit, actually. This exuberant cultural celebration of the individual, with all of its good things that are associated with it, poses, or at least can pose, a real threat to religion and religious freedom. Because while the culture is preaching, do your own thing and be true to yourself, religion, and certainly traditional religion, tends to be preaching something quite different, something quite countercultural. Religion is rarely about doing your own thing. It is usually about doing God's thing. Jesus Christ didn't say, follow your dreams, whatever they may be. He said, come follow me. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The God of Judaism and Christianity declares, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And that includes the God many people see in the mirror and knowingly or not strive to worship each day. The God of Israel is a God of commandments, not just daily personal affirmations, and the same is true of other major religions. So it's not surprising in our current cultural moment that there is a decline in traditional religious faith and a decline in faith in traditional religious institutions. After all, those are the very religious beliefs and institutions that much of modern individualism sought to be liberated from in the first place. Such religious beliefs and institutions are seen not as empowering and ennobling the individual, but as a means for imposing tyrannical beliefs and restrictions on individuals, taking away their freedoms, forcing them to conform, denying their personal and especially sexual autonomy, and worst of all, encouraging believers to vote against other people's freedoms in the political process. All this, and this is my point again, in case you've fallen asleep or you've been checking your Facebook page, all these forces are increasingly causing significant segments in our society to see religion, religious ways of life, and especially religious institutions as oppressive. Is it any wonder, then, that there's pressure to reduce the broad notion of free exercise of religion to the far safer and more private notion of freedom of worship? Is it any wonder that at this very moment, the California legislature is on the verge of passing a bill that will deny student grants and other state aid to religious colleges with supposedly oppressive honor codes like BYU's? Now, I'm no sociologist or political philosopher. I don't mean to suggest that this is a comprehensive account of our present cultural and social context, but I think it's accurate enough to explain at least some of the forces arrayed against traditional religion and religious freedom. And it highlights the moral and cultural narrative behind many of the audiences, from large groups to individuals, that we have to convince as we discuss religious freedom issues. I began by saying that our first imperative is to clearly understand our cultural context so we can understand our audience. Our second imperative, I believe, is to learn how to advocate for religious freedom in terms that speak to the current cultural context that we are now in. Now, I don't have a simple answer or formula for doing that. In fact, it's an area that we all need to be thinking about and experimenting with constantly. What words and phrases and concepts resonate best with those we need to convince? What is the best way to persuasively talk about religious freedom? Many of you here are lawyers. If you had a jury composed of people with many of the individualistic cultural beliefs I've just described, how would you convince them that the free exercise of religion is important and worthy of special respect and protection? Again, I don't know for sure how to do that, only that it's imperative that we find out. But I'd like to suggest some ideas and possibilities for your consideration. You see, I believe we can turn this extremely powerful personal autonomy and individual identity narrative to our advantage. I think that too often we try to convince people that religious freedom is vital by talking about it as a constitutional right. Now, don't get me wrong. It is a constitutional right. It is our first freedom in the First Amendment. That is a reality and truth that we should never deny. But talking about religious freedom that way often isn't very convincing. in the ordinary situations where we need to be most persuasive, when religious freedom appears to conflict with other personal rights and interests. Constitutional rights talk is often too abstract, too impersonal, too divorced from the human context for people to process. Let me give you just a quick example from another context. When the gay marriage movement got going, its advocates, of course, believed and advocated and ultimately won in the Supreme Court on the notion that same-sex marriage is a fundamental right. But they always began their complaints, they always began their legal documents with personal stories, with talking about how Peter and Jack have devoted their lives to each other, had gone through hardships together, and that all they wanted to do was to affirm their relationship legally and culturally through marriage. That sort of powerful personal narrative was ultimately what carried them to the United States Supreme Court and to the victory that they won there. So my point is that in this highly individualistic age, we have to find numerous ways to personalize religious freedom. We have to learn to talk about it not just as a fundamental right, but as something fundamentally important to our lives, our families, our hopes, our dreams, our dignity, our equality, and our very identity. We too have our stories. We too want respect and dignity. We too want to live our lives freely according to our core beliefs. Again, we have to personalize religious freedom. Because when we do, we are now speaking the language of our current cultural context. We are speaking the language of the current morality. We're speaking as one person to another about what matters most to us. I believe that has at least a chance of being much more convincing, even with those who at the moment are our biggest opponents. Because when we speak from the heart about what matters most to us, those who oppose a religious freedom that is important to us will find themselves confronted with the very morality and rhetoric they are likely using to oppose that freedom that we care about. But this is fundamentally important to my dignity and autonomy, they may say. But the opposite is fundamentally important to my dignity and autonomy, we might essentially respond. That doesn't mean we win the argument, but it can help take away the other side's assumption of the moral high ground. And then if we're dealing with people of goodwill, we can turn the discussion to fairness for all, including people of faith, a phrase you've heard LDS church leaders use frequently in recent months. Now, please don't understand me. I'm not suggesting this is some magical universal fix, and if you have a better, more convincing way to advocate religious freedom, one that actually works in the real world, then I'm really anxious to hear about it. But I have become convinced that it is imperative to take what is best about the dominant cultural narrative and use it to defend religious freedom. The third religious freedom imperative is one I'll address only briefly. It's what Elder Wickman spoke about yesterday in his keynote address. We have no choice but to prioritize religious freedoms and not overreach. Not everything that limits what a religious person can do in the name of religion can be successfully defended. And if we insist on defending everything, we will wind up losing what is most essential. Those freedoms that relate to what is most private, intimate, or sacred, like home, family, and children, how we worship and how we organize the ecclesiastical affairs of our religious organizations, these areas are essential to our very survival as religious people and will often be the easiest to defend because our stories and personal experiences will, in that context, be compelling. The same is true of our insistence on equal rights of American citizenship, like free speech and equal participation in the political process. But as we move out from there to areas that are more public and less personal, including areas of commerce that for decades our society has considered akin to a public service, our ability to make compelling arguments and defend religious freedom will necessarily diminish. That is not to say these freedoms are unimportant and shouldn't be argued for. Sometimes it may be important to defend the periphery so we can ensure a better defense of the core. But sometimes a misguided effort to hold marginal territory on the periphery results in a loss of vital territory at the core. We can't afford that. It is imperative, therefore, that we think clearly about this. So read Elder Wickman's talk. It's been posted on lds.org, I understand, this morning. Study the comments made by LDS leaders and other wise voices inside the religious community and within the community of those who are trying to think seriously about these issues, including comments that were made at the time of the Utah Compromise. In those remarks, you will note, especially from LDS leaders, a firm resolve to defend religious freedom, combined with a wise and prudent recognition of what is most vital and what is possible in the actual society we live in. Finally, the last imperative. It is imperative that we get involved in meaningful ways. Armed with a knowledge of the current cultural landscape, having honed our message to be sensitive to that cultural context, having learned how to speak using the language of our current cultural context, and having set prudent priorities, it is now time to act. As Elder Christofferson recently stated, you don't need to run for president or Congress. You don't need to start a movement. And certainly the church doesn't need you to file lawsuits to defend its interests. What is needed is active civic engagement. Lift where you stand. The time is far past when we could simply go to work, tend our own families, and serve in our congregations and call it good. We need to get involved in the institutions around us, schools, business and professional associations, accreditation bodies, political parties, city councils, the state legislature, and on and on. They all need our involvement and voices. So do our neighborhoods and friends, and frankly, so do our Facebook communities. And it's not necessarily that we need to be preaching religious freedom in all these institutions and situations, although there will certainly be moments for that. It's that when religious people are involved in society and doing good things, those they interact with will be much more likely to respect who they are, what they believe, and what they need to live as free and equal citizens in a diverse society. They will be far more likely to be persuaded that pluralism, not cultural domination, is the path to fairness and peace. And on a personal note, I believe that when good people of faith are involved in society, are involved in the practical situations of life, that God can work miracles. He can soften hearts, open minds, and provide the inspiration and wisdom we desperately need to defend religious freedom in these difficult times. Thank you.
Well, I also am very pleased to be here, and I also share the view that others have expressed that this is an especially important topic at this time. I want to explain why I think this is so. Others in the conference have talked about that question, I think, by concentrating on some of the urgent current controversies. I want to take a little different approach by stepping back, way back, not quite as far back as the Council in Heaven, as Brett Scharfs did yesterday, but about 2,000 years back, and try to understand some of our current issues in terms of a historical trajectory. I think it's pretty unlikely that any of my history professors from my undergraduate days here would be in the audience. If they are, I sincerely apologize. I've never been able to overcome my weakness for grandiose historians like Toynbee, so you may hear some of that in these remarks. So there are periods in history that stand out as watershed periods, or fulcrum periods, as one historian put it, in which what comes afterward is not just different than what came before, that's always true, but reflects a fundamental reorientation, for better or worse. The 4th century, in which Christianity and paganism engaged in a sort of struggle for domination, from which Christianity emerged as the winner, at least officially and politically, was one such period. The 16th and 17th centuries were another such period, with the breakup of Christendom. Now, it's hard to get a good read on our own times because we're so close to them. But I think there are reasons to believe that we may be in the middle of another such fulcrum period, and that the current struggle over religious freedom is at the center of the conflict that's going on today. So in these brief remarks, I want to try to sketch, because that's all I'll have time for, why I think this. My story would begin with the religious revolution, or if you like, the Christian Revolution, or the Judeo-Christian Revolution of late antiquity. With reference to late Judaism and Christianity, the Israeli historian Guy Strumsa argues that, quote, the religious transformations of the Mediterranean world in the first centuries of the Roman Empire are so radical that they are properly described as, quote, a paradigm shift in the domain of the religious. And Strumsa observes that the conflict between paganism and Christianity is so fascinating, quote, because it had decisive consequences for the future of Western culture. So what was the nature of this revolution? Well, at bottom, I think it was a drastic change in the conception of who and what God is. The pagan gods were immortal and powerful beings who needed to be placated, but they were actors alongside us in this world with their own affairs and agendas to attend to. They were only incidentally and occasionally concerned with us. The biblical God, by contrast, was a transcendent being, one who was our creator and father, whose work and glory was, as we might say, to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of human beings. And he was a God who so loved the world and so loved us that he sent his only begotten Son to live out a mortal life so that he could understand us, have compassion on us, and save us. This change in the understanding of deity was not merely an abstract theological development. It implied a whole different orientation toward the world, including personhood, sexuality, death, and life generally, and toward politics. David Bentley Hart writes that, quote, even the most ardent secularists among us generally cling to notions of human rights, economic and social justice, providence for the indigent, legal equality, or basic human dignity that pre-Christian Western culture would have found not so much foolish as unintelligible. It is simply the case that we distant children of the pagans would not be able to believe in any of these things. They would never have occurred to us had our ancestors not once believed that God is love, that charity is the foundation of all virtues, that all of us are equal before the eyes of God, that to fail to feed the hungry or care for the suffering is to sin against Christ, and that Christ laid down his life for the least of his brethren. Now, one feature of the Christian Revolution that's especially pertinent to our theme in this conference was suggested in Jesus' famous teaching that we should render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. In stark contrast to the Roman understanding, in which both political and religious authority were consolidated in the same men and institutions, Jesus' teaching suggested that there are two authorities that we have to respect: the temporal authority, Caesar, but also the spiritual authority, God. This idea of dual authorities was elaborated by later Christian thinkers, by St. Augustine with the idea of the two cities, by Luther and Calvin with the doctrine of the two kingdoms. There isn't time to elaborate here, but I would argue that this Christian political dualism, if we can call it that, was the foundation for a great deal of what we value in modern law and government, including the ideas of separation of church and state, limited government, and hence the idea of human rights against the state. But of course, like his other teachings, Jesus' teaching about God and Caesar wasn't promptly accepted. More generally, Christian ideas of sexuality, government, and civic obligation were radically different from Roman and pagan notions, and so, not surprisingly, as the new religion grew, conflicts often arose. These developed into a full-scale struggle in the 4th century. Early in that century, in what's called the Great Persecution, the Emperor Diocletian and his imperial colleagues attempted to eradicate Christianity. Reports from that period are horrific. The Christian scholar Lactantius, who lived through the persecution, described some of the imaginative and gruesome tortures inflicted on Christians and reported that, quote, to be beheaded was an indulgence shown to very few. Then Constantine and his son and successor Constantius first commanded toleration and later began to confer special privileges on Christianity. Upon Constantius' death, the flamboyantly pagan Emperor Julian reversed course and attempted to bring about a revival of paganism, including by barring Christians from teaching in the schools. Some historians believe that if Julian had lived longer, he might have been successful in this effort. But Julian was killed in an ill-advised invasion of Persia, and later emperors episodically returned to favoring Christianity. By the end of the century, Christianity had prevailed, at least as an official and political matter. And how did Christianity achieve this political success? Well, some historians tend to emphasize coercive edicts or laws issued by Christian emperors that purported to impose serious sanctions, including death, on those who persisted in pagan practices. But other historians observe that these laws were so little enforced that they seem to have gone mostly unnoticed by prominent pagans at the time. It seems that the decisive struggle occurred not so much through coercive laws as through public symbols. Christian emperors built impressive churches, often on the sites formerly occupied by pagan temples. Julian, the pagan emperor, reversed this process, and he was in turn reversed by his Christian successors. By dominating the city's skyline, so to speak, these churches and temples communicated to citizens the nature of the city they inhabited. One especially controversial symbol was the Altar of Victory, a pagan shrine that had been prominently placed next to the door of the Senate House by the first emperor, Augustus. The Christian emperor Constantius ordered the altar removed. The pagan emperor Julian had it restored. Later, the Christian emperor Gratian again had the altar taken down, whereupon the pagan senator Symmachus wrote an eloquent plea to the Emperor Valentinian II requesting restoration of the altar, a plea that was in turn stoutly opposed by Milan's influential bishop, Ambrose, who threatened the emperor with excommunication if he reinstated the altar. All the disputants in this controversy recognized the symbolic importance of the shrine. We might say that they implicitly understood the theme of a more recent, much admired academic book by Benedict Anderson called Imagined Communities. What transforms a collection of people into community, Anderson argues, rather than merely an assortment of disparate individuals buzzing around and bouncing off each other, is not simply the empirical fact of geographic proximity. Communities are not physical objects. They are conjured up and consolidated, rather, in people's imaginations, in their minds and souls. People constitute a community because they think of themselves or imagine themselves as a community. And the imaginings that create a community arise around and in response to and express and maintain themselves in public symbols. Symbols express the community, in other words, but they also help to constitute the community. By controlling the public symbols, Christians like Ambrose managed to reconstitute the empire as Christian, as an official and political matter. Now, I've stressed that qualifier as an official and political matter 3 times now, though, because, of course, in reality, political and social life always fell drastically short of Christian ideals. It can almost seem that the Christianity that supposedly triumphed in the 4th century has never been much more than a sort of veneer covering a still largely pagan or secular reality. Even so, the veneer, if that's what it was, has been important because it has applied a sort of regulative ideal against which politics and law and Christianity itself have been understood and judged. And part of that regulative ideal has been the 2 authorities, God and Caesar idea that Jesus first articulated. In the American tradition, this idea is succinctly expressed in Lincoln's observation, and now in the Pledge of Allegiances, that this is one nation under God. That idea provided the essential premise for the justifications for religious freedom articulated by American founders, including Jefferson and Madison. Almighty God hath created the mind of man free, Jefferson's Virginia statute for religious freedom begins, and religious coercion is thus, quote, a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion. Madison developed a similar idea with care in his famous Memorial and Remonstrance, from which President Matt Holland quoted yesterday. Madison argued that we are subject to the Creator before we are subject to civil society and government. Therefore, in matters of religion, civil society and government have no cognizance, as Madison put it, or no jurisdiction. Historically, in other words, the American commitment to religious freedom is a descendant of the Christian teaching about dual authorities, God and Caesar. And the connection runs both ways. Remember, symbols express the character of our community, but they also help to constitute it. Our commitment to religious freedom has been a central symbol of our commitment as a community to the understanding that we are one nation under God. And that premise, as I've suggested, has in turn been the foundation for much else that we value, including the ideas of limited government and hence of rights against the state. So, with this very abbreviated background, let's think about our current culture wars, and in particular about the struggle over religious freedom. My suggestion is that what we see today, and what we've been seeing over the last few decades, is in effect a sustained effort to reverse the Christian revolution that was secured in the 4th century, and to overthrow the Christian or biblical regulative ideal that has guided us, and has guided much of Western civilization until relatively recently. This campaign is perhaps most evident in the area of sexuality. As a recent study by historian Kyle Harper shows, sexual morality was, as a practical matter, the most obvious dividing line between Christians and pagans in the Roman Empire, and I think Harper's observation seems valid again today. But although the themes of sexuality and religious freedom are today closely entangled, Our conference is focused mostly on the latter theme, and I think we can understand the substance and the passions of many modern controversies about religious freedom if we appreciate that the contending parties are attempting to maintain on the one side, or on the other side to repudiate, public and constitutive public symbols that reflect the Christian or dual authorities heritage in which our political tradition has been grounded, and thus to replace God and Caesar as a public or political matter with Caesar. Many recent religious clause controversies are on their face, about symbols, of course. Controversies over nativity scenes, crosses, Ten Commandments monuments, words in the national motto or the Pledge of Allegiance, and so forth. But I think symbolism is central to many other religion clause controversies as well. The Supreme Court's portentous and immensely controversial school prayer decisions in the early 1960s were provocative in part or mostly because of what school prayer symbolized, and thus what its rejection symbolized. After all, as critics pointed out, a brief, theologically thin prayer recited in class or over the loudspeaker at the beginning of the school day probably did little to instill genuine piety in students. And conversely, in a school setting in which students are routinely compelled to listen to a great deal that many of them find disagreeable or offensive or simply boring, it might seem that sitting or fidgeting in silence during a brief rote prayer should have inflicted no great damage on dissenting students. And yet, these exercises, conducted daily in the public institutions understood to be entrusted with the formation of future citizens, arguably had a powerful effect, and this was presumably what dissenters found painful in signaling the community's official commitment to biblical values and authority. Our current battles, though, are not about prayer, but rather about free exercise accommodation of people whose religion is burdened by generally applicable laws, like the so-called contraception mandate. Less than 25 years ago, when Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act with almost unanimous support and with effusive praise from President Bill Clinton, as Brett Scharfs, I think, discussed yesterday, the commitment to free exercise accommodation seemed one of the few things about which Americans were united. Today, of course, the situation is utterly different, as recent experiences in Arizona, Indiana, Georgia, and elsewhere demonstrate, and as the controversies in the Hobby Lobby and Little Sisters cases reflect. Today, the idea of free exercise accommodation provokes strident opposition from many academics, judges, pundits, politicians, and important parts of corporate America. Now, we've heard a lot about these controversies already in this conference, and I imagine we'll hear more, so I won't try to repeat the details, but I do want to call your attention to one interesting aspect of these controversies. In popular debates, I believe, opponents of religious liberty measures routinely resort to distortions and misrepresentations of the proposed measures. But in more academic discussions, opponents tend to argue that there's no good justification for giving, quote unquote, special treatment to religion over other human concerns and commitments. Ironically, the opponents themselves seem to single out religions for special treatment, or perhaps for special mistreatment. After all, governments routinely accommodate all sorts of people on basis of all sorts of factors, like financial need, medical condition, physical or mental disabilities, minority status, and so forth. In fact, virtually every law involves the accommodation of competing interests, whether the accommodations are expressed in terms of explicit exceptions or are built into the body of the laws. There's no constitutional or public policy objection to accommodation, even when accommodation imposes burdens on other parties, as it almost always does. And accommodation is usually thought of as a good thing, unless, it seems, the accommodation is of religious commitments. In the emerging view, that is the one thing the government is presumptively barred from accommodating. Opponents of religious accommodation thus single out religion for a special disability. Interestingly, academic opponents will typically still allow accommodation of religion so long as it occurs under the heading of conscience. In the days of the Vietnam War, non-theistic pacifists like Daniel Seeger and Elliot Welsh could sometimes be excused from the draft by piggybacking their moral objections onto an exemption defined in theistic terms. Today, by contrast, in one prominent view, theistic objectors may be able to get accommodation by piggybacking their commitments onto a category, conscience, now understood in non-theistic terms. For me, the important theme running through these debates and developments is that in the emerging view, government can accommodate all sorts of people and interests so long as the rationale is not the two authorities, God and Caesar view that came with the Christian Revolution and that was the basis for Jefferson's and Madison's support for religious freedom. In fact, this transformation is explicit even in many proponents of free exercise accommodation. Government should accommodate a religion, many of them think, because the Constitution or the statutes say so, or maybe because religion is important to personal authenticity or integrity. But government should not accommodate on the basis of theological rationales or out of deference to any supposed higher power. So you can still speak in favor of religious freedom. What you're not supposed to say is what Jefferson said, that religious freedom is important because Almighty God hath created the mind free. And in fact, under current constitutional doctrine, Jefferson's seminal statute is in principle blatantly unconstitutional as a violation of religious freedom, ironically, because in saying that Almighty God hath created the mind free, the statute sends a clear message endorsing religion. In sum, I think the battle over religious freedom both reflects and is helping to bring about a reversal of the 4th century Christian revolution. More specifically, it reflects and is helping to bring about a transformation in our conception of our political community. Not one nation under God, not God and Caesar, but only Caesar. A Caesar that purports and perhaps aspires to be wise and just and good, yes, but one that recognizes no authority above itself. This is a change with worrisome implications for religious freedom, but more generally, if like me, you deeply distrust Caesar's wisdom and goodness, or to put the point differently, if like me you believe that much of what we have come to value in law and government is attributable to the Christian Revolution, this is a change with worrisome implications for government and our social order generally. Our current struggle over religious freedom is immensely important in its own right, but I'm suggesting that it's even more broadly important because it's central in constituting the kind of political community that we and our children and our grandchildren will inhabit. Thank you.
Well, our speakers have adhered to their times with remarkable probity, and we're very grateful for that, and that leaves us about a half hour for questions. So if I can figure out how to get this microphone to go on, we've got people, I presume, passing the mic. You've got a microphone, and so I'll give one to, I just don't know how to turn this on. So we'll give one to them. So, do we have questions from the audience? It's said that the first question is always the hardest, so we could proceed directly to the second question. I see one back there.
If LGBTQ, quote, rights are declared to be fundamental rights, what do you perceive to be the ramifications to religious institutions?
Nice general question. Do you want to start with that, Alexander? Or?
It seems to me, can you hear me? It seems to me that if LGBT status is raised to the level of a suspect class, which I think is really the core of what you're asking in legal terms, that the entire civil rights apparatus that was created to exterminate racism will be brought to bear to get rid of and to minimize to the maximum extent possible, to stigmatize and to push out of our major institutions and even out of polite society views regarding marriage, family, gender, and sexuality that are perceived not to be consistent with LGBT rights. So, religion has a lot to say about sexuality. It's and about gender, and it's not just some new thing that was concocted to justify oppressive regimes. A lot of things that were said to defend slavery in the name of religion were just complete religious nonsense. But religious viewpoints and beliefs regarding marriage, family, gender, and sexuality go way, way back, and have existed long before anyone was talking about these issues. They go to the heart of aspects of Christianity and Judaism and other traditional religions. They are not going away. They are constitutive of what many of these religions are about. And what that portends is lots of very serious conflicts between the state and the institutions that embody those particular ideals.
Well, I guess I agree with that. That's a nice answer. I'm tempted not to try and say it's a really hard question. It probably depends a lot on various prudential assessments, and it would depend a lot on the particulars of whatever constitutional doctrines the Supreme Court might announce, or other courts might announce, or the particular statutes might deal with, might establish. For me, it's hard because you say if LGBT rights, if that comes to be seen as a right, well, like some speakers yesterday, I think Tim Schultz and others, I probably agree in substance with some of the non-discrimination measures that are proposed. I don't think discrimination on basis of sexual orientation is just or appropriate in lots of situations. I'm nonetheless nervous about different kinds of legal recognition of such thing for a couple reasons. One is just that, and I think this is true in marriage as well, much of what's happening, I think, in these areas is not just that some particular substantive issue like marriage or discrimination is being resolved in one way or another, but it's often a question about whether more authority is being entrusted to particular actors to define such matters in the future and then to use them. So with marriage, it's not just that marriage has been redefined legally, but it's been that a change, I think, has been that the state, rather than tradition or nature or something, has now been thought to be the authority that gets to define this sort of thing. And that can be, I think, fraught with implications well beyond just the particular substantive issue that's being resolved. And I think that's true for LGBT rights as well. So that's one concern that I have there, I guess. I'll try and give a quick illustration. I taught for a few years at Notre Dame, and Notre Dame Law School was, for a while resisted the American Law School Association signing on to one of its non-discrimination policies. That seemed a little odd to some people, I think, because Notre Dame's official Catholic doctrine officially taught the same things. Notre Dame was committed in principle to the substance of the AALS's policy. But I thought they were understandably reluctant to sign on because they understood that to do that would be to turn over resolution of controversies about this matter to the AALS, to the American Law School Association, which some of us might think there are various reasons not to trust completely. I'll if I can indulge in another statement there, and I think the same is true with statutes and other constitutional doctrines. The other aspect of the question, I think, that for me is really hard is that I think a lot of these things are important as much, or maybe even more important, for the symbolism that they contain. I tried to convey some of that sense in the talk that I gave, and these things, I think, also redefine. They help to define what kind of community we think we belong to, and so there can be reasons to be very skeptical about some of these things, even if, like me, you actually in principle agree with some of the substance of what's being proposed.
Let's see, Brett, and then, well, let's see, why don't we take the two up there while the microphone's up there, and then Brett, why don't we take 3 questions and then responses, so.
I would love to hear you two talk about each other's presentations and what we're to make of the two of them. So Steve, for example, is Alexander's proposal to speak in terms of kind of the current zeitgeist of dignity and autonomy and authenticity, is that hopelessly misguided because it doesn't get at the real issue of Christianity versus paganism? And Alexander, is it hopelessly misguided for Steve to suggest that we go out there and talk about how this is really a titanic fight that has gone back to the 4th century. And it seems to me that those kinds of questions relate to what I just heard both of you say about practical questions, perhaps about whether you're sort of willing to accept a sexual orientation, gender identity law with proper exemptions, or do you have to kind of fight on the more symbolic ground? So I'd love to hear you talk about each other's presentations briefly. Thanks.
Okay, let's see, there's one other question that was close up there. Yes? Go ahead there. And then down to Brett Scharf's.
So we have to answer multiple questions within multiple questions? Is that how this is going to work?
We'll. All right, okay. There's been a plea to let them answer. And also, I've had a plea. You have to act like rock stars. You keep the mic right in front of you. Yeah, okay.
Let me just respond to that question, because I think it's a really important one. When I raise this issue in the context of a roundtable that Robbie George, the Princeton professor and Catholic theorist and religious freedom advocate, he just absolutely dismissed it. He thought it was just rubbish philosophy, and it may be rubbish philosophy, and it may not be the right way to fight a civilizational conflict. In fact, it probably isn't. But we're not necessarily, in every context, fighting a civilizational conflict. We're trying to be persuasive. We're trying to make our way through a cultural context that is very challenging. And in order to do that, we have to employ, in my view, the rhetoric that has been given to us, the rhetorical resources that exist within the society that we live in. And I have struggled for many years to think through what else we might do, because the language has changed, the propositions have changed. All of these tectonic shifts that Professor Smith is talking about have altered the very nature of our understandings and our ability to to fight over these issues. I remember talking with one Catholic theologian about a related issue, and he, I said, what do we do? What do we say? I started asking him to try to get through this. How can we be persuasive with the Supreme Court and with the courts? And he proceeded, after he had a few drinks in him, he proceeded to begin with a story. And he said, back in the Middle Ages, every spring, the wealthy young men would strap on their armor and get on their horses and go off to war. And that's what they did. And they rather enjoyed that. And that's what it was to be a young nobleman in some town. And it took the Catholic Church, he said, 4 centuries to get a grip on the thou shalt not kill piece of the 10 Commandments. And I said, well, what does that mean for the short term? And he said, well, in the short term, we're just completely, and then he expletive deleted. Well, we don't have 4 centuries. To refight these civilizational conflicts, we have to get through the next decade or two, where a lot of these issues are going to be resolved. And so I think we have to be mindful of the larger context, the larger struggle between Caesar, those things that are rendered to Caesar and those things that are rendered to God. But we also have to get through the next legislative session. We got to get through the conversation that we're in. We got to get through the court case that we're in. We got to help persuade our communities that we can get along.
So I'll just say I'm often grateful that I'm a detached academic who can sort of sit back and think about things and try and diagnose and understand the situation, and I don't have to actually decide what to do or how to, as other people have to make those sorts of decisions, because I think they're really hard decisions and I'm unsure. I hear people like some of the speakers yesterday and Alexander today really stressing, well, we got to be practical, we got to make compromises, etc. I hear people like Robbie George and people of a similar mind who make the other sort of argument. And I really am, I can see wisdom in both positions, and I'm really not sure how to come out. I'll do this maybe in terms, on the one hand, Alexander is surely right. You have to talk to people in their own terms. I mean, if you, in terms they understand and they can, you know, you might think Greek is a superior language, but if you talk to me in Greek, I'm not going to understand you. So you kind of got to talk to me, and the same is true with anybody. On the other hand, as Alexander was saying that, one worry that came to mind was this. It sounded to me a little bit like what you heard from, you know, a few decades ago from mainstream Christian churches who kept saying, we got to make our message relevant. We got to talk in today's terms. Those churches, I think, have sort of declined. There's this risk that if you try too much to talk in the other people's terms, you'll lose the message that you have. You know, you'll lose your own commitment. So that's just a worry to keep in mind. And it's a worry that's underscored, I think, if, like me, you think there's some sort of civilizational conflict going on, because then it may seem a little less realistic to say, and I wrote this down also, as Alexander said, if we assume that we're speaking with people of goodwill, well, you always have to, I don't want to deny that exactly, but I do want to say I think it's sometimes naive to think that each side is sincerely expressing its exact concerns, being reasonable, just trying to realize those concerns, and then people will be happy. I think there's a lot more going on than that. So I think it's worrisome. But on the third hand, I think this is about my third hand, and this will come back around to Alexander, and I'll try and end with this. A lot of times Christians, Mormons, others will say, well, and this is something I believe, what we really need to do is build our own communities, our own families, and so forth. And as maybe a lot in the culture collapses around us, you know, our example then may teach people who would otherwise be unteachable about the virtues of, you know, of things we believe and ways of life that we accept. And it may well be that something like the Utah Compromise or similar kinds of measures are what will give us the space for at least a period of time to do that. I'm sensitive to that concern as well. So I end where I started by saying I'm glad other people actually have to make these decisions as to what actually to do. I have my apprehensions, as you can tell, but I'm not ready to dismiss, as Robbie apparently did, as rubbish, the sort of strategy you favor.
Let me just exert my prerogative as a chair. I think one of the things about the two statements, if you're trying to speak to the current culture, it helps to think back to some of the older collisions, to reach back for arguments. I often tell students that if they read Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, they can find virtually every argument that ever gets made regarding religious freedom, but you have to contextualize it. So in that sense, I think the two are not inconsistent. One needs to reach back and expand horizons, but one also needs to figure out ways to make what you then learn from the richer traditions relevant to the current situation.
Let me make one brief comment on that. I agree entirely with what Professor Smith just said. Our audience, our primary audience, is still that big swath of Americans that are not ideologically passionate about these issues. They want to be decent. They want to be nice. They want to be friendly. They don't want to be seen as discriminatory. They don't want to be seen as oppressive. For the most part, I believe those folks, not the advocates on either side of this fight, but those folks are eminently persuadable. We just have to find terms that are true to underlying truths, yes, but terms that are nevertheless persuasive to their current cultural ears. I think Mormon missionaries, by the way, do this all the time. Mm-hmm. They talk about what this means to them and then invite people to see if it could be as equally meaningful to them as well. That's a language that the Mormons in the room, at least, are fairly comfortable with in lots of other contexts. And it is fairly effective for spreading the message and for having people at least think that we're halfway decent people.
Okay, so we had the question up there.
Thank you. I wonder if you would both comment on the way that this cultural transformation that you've both described in different ways is being sort of fought out or agendized inside the public schools. In particular, those of us who are in public school governance are seeing three things come down from the federal executive branch in an unusually aggressive way. One is the amicus briefs that get filed with, particularly in circuit court cases, in favor of LGBTQ rights. The second is this, they're having us report a lot more, and then using the reporting for their third tactic, which is to bring Office of Civil Rights investigations into school districts and then work out agreements or compromises that favor the agenda that the federal executive branch is trying to push. So if you could maybe comment on how that battle's going to go and what we can be doing in school governance. And then also, you know, we see parents email us and say, just to let you know, we don't agree with the OCR letter, et cetera. What really is the effective thing to do about that strategy that's being used by the executive branch right now?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to answer in the abstract. You probably know a lot more about the specifics. It sounds like you do know a lot more than I do about the specifics of what is happening in the public schools right now. All I'll say is this. Schools were important in the Roman Empire. I think that's why the Emperor Julian sort of understood that he didn't have to prohibit Christianity. If he could just keep Christians from teaching in the schools, which was the place where all the future leaders of society would be formed, he would win over time. And that was understood, I think. And even some of his supporters thought that this, in some ways, sort of bland measure was intolerably, restrictive and so forth. And that's true today, too, I think. So I think it's just absolutely predictable that the schools, that will form future generations will be a focus of a lot of these efforts. Specifically, what measures are being done now and how to resist them, I think those are the kinds of questions, sadly, that I tend to leave to the lawyers who are actually litigating such issues. So I don't know if you are or not.
The schools are a major cultural flashpoint for the reasons that Professor Smith just mentioned, and they have been for decades now. The common school was always a major cultural flashpoint. It's the very agenda of the common public school was to enforce or to inculcate a certain notion and idea of America, and frankly at the time of America as a Protestant nation. So these battles have been going on for a long time, and this current wave is I was about to say is no different. It is different in many ways, but it is one more flashpoint. What to do? People have to get involved. I mean, we live in a democracy. Yes, it's true that the Office of Civil Rights can issue its edicts and its dear colleague letters and things like that. But if people rise up and say, we have concerns, this doesn't account for this issue or that issue, this is a problem, then politicians and bureaucrats change, they bend. There's a conversation that is engaged. Our system is designed, as Elder Wickman talked about yesterday, to accommodate and to create resolutions and compromises, and they may be messy and they may take years to fight out. So people have to get involved. It can't just be the professional educators. That's a model that's not going to work if we want to preserve some elements of traditional culture within the public schools, if that's part of your set of concerns, or if we want to preserve the ability of parents to have a big say in the education of their children and to ensure that the education of their children is not expressly focused on undermining their religious values. So I would say get involved and raise your voice. And you're not going to know how to do it at first, so go in and make your mistakes. And nobody knows exactly how to do this. But what we do know is that if we sit on the sidelines, it's not going to work. Other people will make the decisions for us.
Great, let's see. Next question was Brett.
My question is related to the first one asked above, I think, in a way. There was this diagnosis of a major cultural transformation taking place, and I'm interested in the reaction you have to each other again. Alexander, as I understood your major diagnosis. It was that we live in a time of tremendous individualism, and individualism is the key sort of social transformation that we're trying to contend with. And Steve, if I understood your argument, we're sort of in a sort of a statist transformation where, you know, the big challenge we are facing is the challenge to the dual kingdom understanding of reality, to sort of a just Caesar, a statist. And I found myself nodding yes to both of you as you were speaking, and now I find myself scratching my head because these sort of cultural diagnoses seem really different.
Let me just offer a quick comment on that, and I'll give it to Professor Smith. I think the individualism that I'm talking about is, to an extent, a paganistic individualism, and maybe that sort of bridges the gap. It is an individualism very much of do your own thing, follow your own God. Remember, paganism involved a multiplicity of gods with a multiplicity of characteristics, rather than a one true God and a one true narrative. Christianity and Judaism, of course, are very different. They make exclusive claims, epistemological and theological and eschatological claims. I got all those words in one sentence. That was pretty good, wasn't it? Yeah, soteriological. There we go. And so they had these they made these grand claims and eventually crowded out the paganistic claims. One way, and others have written about this, of viewing our current cultural context is that this is a rise of a sort of a new paganism, and that it is in conflict with what is now an older form of organizing society and thinking about how we ought to live together.
I agree with all that, so I'll just say very quickly that I can see, Brett, how it does seem looked at one way that these interpretations would be contradictory, but I don't think they are. And in fact, I think there have been a fair number of pretty astute social commentators, from people like Robert Nisbet, I think you quoted, and going back to Tocqueville that President Holland talked about yesterday, who have really seen the importance of having lots of intermediate associations and forms of life, and have worried about a tendency in which basically there's the individual and the state and not much in between. So I think that can easily happen, and it's, whether at some level it's inconsistent, I don't know, but it's a practical possibility to be concerned about, I think.
Okay, let's see. Question here, Dwayne Madsen at the front.
Thank you for your excellent comments. As I listen to what I've heard, it seems to me that the Civil Rights Act is a defense of traditional historical values as well as some of these emerging aberrant values. It seems as if those who represent the traditional values are just not, as you have said, vocal enough about using the civil rights laws to defend their own rights. Would you comment on that, please?
No, I think that's a good point. Religion is one of the categories and classes included within the '64 Civil Rights Act. And we should never yield the high ground. Religious freedom is our first freedom. It is our first civil right, and we ought to say that and say it often. Now, we need to say it in ways that that resonate with people, but absolutely. As others are insisting upon non-discrimination, religious people need to insist on non-discrimination as well. And as others decry justly bigoted speech against LGBT people and others, we also need to call out bigoted speech against religious people. We need to make sure that that workplaces are being appropriately accommodating of religious sensibilities and religious needs. There's a lot of research suggesting that it's good for business that it do so. And not only is it good for business, but it's the right thing to do. Just as it's the right thing to do to treat LGBT people with humanely and decently, That's a vision I think that we can all embrace. I hope we can all embrace, and it's enshrined to an extent in the civil rights laws as well.
So I think we have time for one more question. Let's midway up, Beck. Yeah, you've seen.
My great-grandfather was imprisoned as a matter of conscience for practicing polygamy. In 1890, we have the manifesto by President Woodruff eliminating polygamy from the LDS Church. Now that came after Congress basically disenfranchised, disincorporated, escheated church property. Is it far-fetched to think that Congress or a state may take similar actions today or in the future because of any church's religious position or stance?
Yes. For the moment, it's far-fetched to think that any government in the United States would take actions that are that draconian, based upon beliefs, I assume you're talking about, regarding marriage and family and gender and sexuality. What is not far-fetched, however, is that government might revoke tax-exempt status over those kinds of issues. Now, I'm not saying that's an imminent threat, but that dialogue has been unleashed. It was unleashed at the U.S. Supreme Court when a softball question was thrown to the Solicitor General in the middle of the same-sex marriage case, and I was in the Supreme Court watching and listening, and I thought for sure when asked about tax-exempt status that the Solicitor General would simply say, "Oh, well, of course that's not an issue. It's not a problem." That would have been the right thing to do as an advocate, it seemed to me, to try to keep the issue narrow and try to say that a victory for gay marriage would not result in anything harmful to religious organizations. Of course not. But instead, really, to the shock of everyone in the room, I thought, he said, well, that's an issue we're going to have to resolve. We're going to have to get into. And my job, I'd hit the floor. And so I don't think that's a proximate threat. I don't think that's going to happen tomorrow or next year or the year after. But I think that religious people need to be vigilant. Lots of things are up for debate, and we cannot simply sit back in our homes and with our families and in our churches and just do our own thing. We have to engage as citizens in the great debate over the proper line between what we owe to Caesar and what we owe to God.
Well, thank you very much for this session. We're out of time for this particular session, but would like to please join me in thanking our panelists.